All right. Next thing. All right, let's go on to our Devwatch for today. This won't take very long because it's a relatively short. It's not a full dev video or anything. It's just he said something which is well, once again, worthy of contention. This is on Twitter, and he has said the following. Dev says, yes, I am actually okay with government requesting media corporations not broadcast what they believe to be enemy propaganda, and I don't think the request means that the corporations are forced to do it. So this is a little bit of naivety from Dev here, to put it lightly. What he's essentially doing here is he's justifying the FBI meddling with Twitter and coercing them to censor people regarding the elections. So the problem at base is that Dev trusts governments, which is not the kind of thing that a full-grown adult does, unfortunately. Not these days. Maybe some other day, but not these days. The problem is, Dev, that even if what you were saying was completely correct and above board, it should still be... The government doesn't have any business saying what can and can't be broadcast. It is essentially a First Amendment violation, even if they're just asking, even if they just mention it, because there is implicit coercion there. You could argue that they could put out a bulletin in general just to say, we believe this is enemy propaganda. The problem is it was much, much worse than that. If you've read the Twitter files, it was definitely coercive, if not in some cases forced. And also, it looks like the FBI had infiltrators inside Twitter who were making sure it happened and eventually took over large parts of Twitter. Retired FBI officers became major figures in the company. Like, that's assuming that it was all above board. That's assuming that it really was enemy propaganda and there was no coercion. But there was coercion and it wasn't enemy propaganda. So, Dev, even if you want to hold this position, which, as I said, is dangerously naive, you would still want to put in there somewhere, I would recommend, the point that, however, in the case of Twitter, it wasn't enemy propaganda and there was coercion. Therefore, this only applies in an ideal situation. And I would still probably disagree that it even applies in an ideal situation, but you should at least clarify that you're not making that point. Now, unfortunately, Dev, because you haven't done that, one must assume that perhaps that's what you're talking about here. And unfortunately, that is much more than the ideal case, which I was generously providing to you as an option. But what's more, Dev, not only was it not enemy propaganda, this is about the laptop primarily, but it's also in general. But not only was the laptop not enemy propaganda, but there's every reason to believe that the people that were saying it was knew it wasn't. And again, you don't mention any of that. This is part of the problem here, Dev. Aside from all of your other problems, part of the reason that people think that you've become so horrendously biased is because you will say half of the truth, and the half that you've said strongly implies that your position is something completely wrong. Now, if that's not your position, bruh, it's your opportunity to say that, to make sure that it's clear that you don't actually believe it. That you recognize the Hunter Biden laptop was not enemy propaganda, and that there was coercion revealed in the Twitter files. Your opportunity to say that. I recommend say that, because otherwise you look so much worse. But I suspect that we cannot, in fact, be that generous to you. Now, the other side of this is what Clown World's man here that Dev is responding to describes as, he is so drunk on government. He goes on to say other things, of course, but that is one way of putting it. As I said, Dev, the position of just trusting government, which you seem to do for some reason, you have a strong tendency towards just trusting institutions. It's not a mature position, especially these days, but also in general. It's responsible to constantly doubt government, to be skeptical, and to criticize them when they even might have done something wrong, because they are responsible to the people. They should be accountable, and the only way you maintain that is vigilance. If you have the intelligence and the inclination to care about politics, you have a duty to hold them accountable, to be skeptical of them. But you, for some reason, aren't. And you have this general tendency, this general bias towards that, and it's very much part of one of those three things that I have said repeatedly you prioritize above the truth in matters of politics. The first being, the relevant one, political nostalgia. Pining for a time when politics was like it was when you were a kid. At which time, granted, it still wasn't mature to fully trust your government, but it was less indefensible back then, in the 90s and early noughties, to fully trust your government. Less indefensible. Especially when you, and indeed I, were younger at the time. So trusting your government fully was more understandable individually as well as in general. So that's where you're making that mistake. The second thing that he puts above the truth is this faux centrism, where I consider myself, in a sense, a centrist, in a sense, but Dev thinks of it as some kind of mantra, some kind of orthodoxy, where he has to be, in some sense, rigidly or mathematically balanced between what he perceives as the two sides. When people ask me in the past, well, you call yourself a centrist, does that mean that you just position yourself between the far left and the far right of the Overton window and just move yourself with it? That's ridiculous. Centrism does not have to align itself with the Overton window. I can align myself with what I believe are more objective poles of political thought, which don't have to align with the Overton window. They may slightly move with it, but they don't have to. That's what I would consider to be what I do. I have a philosophical understanding of what centrism means, not necessarily a modern-day political one. But you, Dev, I always assume that no one does that, right? No one just aligns himself with the center of whatever is currently popular, tries desperately to appeal to both sides while failing to appeal to either properly, and maintains this opinion that mere simple balance of opinions, that you can have as many on one side as the other, is the correct approach. That whether you do that deliberately or not is in fact what you're doing. No one does that, right? But apparently people do. Now, I don't know if Dev does it quite as much as it's stereotyped as doing, but he does seem to do it. And it's often been referred to as dead centrism, the idea that you're aiming for the dead center, but also dead centrism because the ideology is dead stupid or is dead to any value. And the third thing that you put as a priority above the truth, and that one's not particularly relevant here. Yeah, I think I could do more to express what is wrong with the way Dev is acting these days, and I have done on previous streams, but I think I did an okay job of it there. It's yeah, exactly, Somnus. That's a good way of assessing it. This covers both the Troon stuff and the faux centrism, dead centrism stuff. But it is odd what Dev's motivation ultimately could be for shifting now. Like, what's changed these days that's causing him to shift? I'm not sure. Maybe with the increasing momentum and power that the right is gaining, maybe that's all it took. Maybe Dev is by default leaning left. Of course, with the culture war, he ends up leaning slightly right, or at least allying himself with the right. But that he was slightly leaning left by default, and that all it took was for the right to gain a little bit of power, and suddenly they look worse to him than the left does, or at least about as bad. I'm trying to give him out here, trying to give him an honest way for this to make sense, rather than just somebody wants him to believe the stuff that he does. Like, maybe it's just a simple matter that people on the right have been mocking him for his more than the people on the left have.
As any decent person should.
Well, I think it's unhealthy, yeah.
Yep. I've not met one person that likes that shit who is, like, has their head properly, screwed on their shoulders.
So, Di, have you seen something that Motch created in the last 24 hours that's relevant to this?
No, what'd she make?
Motch made this artwork.
Oh my goodness, Motch. She must really like you, huh? Making such horrendous things.
This was completely her idea.
She literally drew Dev, man. She must really like you.
It's really good, and I commend Motch for making it. But yeah, what was I going to say about this? As you can see, Di, the characters around Dev here are all actual people.
Who's the one with the mustache?
Hold on, I'll get to that in a second. Let me just do this. and I can show you by pointing at them. That's V. That's Spoon. That I think is meant to be Arch. That's me. That's Sargon. That's Aiden. That's Scrump. And that's Cabal.
I see. Okay, gotcha.
And then this. So Motch did not invent the original concept for the comic. It's based on an existing comic, but she completely changed all the characters and
why does Aiden look why does Aiden look like a femboy?
You mean in real life or in the comic?
I mean, in the comic.
Once again, breaking the Women Alliance in real time. Yeah, so there is a little video clip of Dev going into more detail on this, which we can watch now. It's only 2 minutes long, but watch me just get get so angry at his stupidity that we spend the rest of the stream on this.
Again, it's not public. They do it in private. They do it. Make sure the public isn't aware, and to censor U.S. citizens, which is, of course, after the fact ruled as a direct violation of the Constitution. We can call that corruption. That is political corruption because it was done for partisan reasons by partisan actors.
Right? The government just gave the banks the ability to deplatform people. The government
is that him?
Hang.
That was Sargon and that was V.
That's a different conversation, V.
Hang on. Right, that is crystal clear corruption, and I don't see why you would argue the opposite.
Because I'm not sure it is. I think it's a different kind of violation.
Okay,
but I'm not. Now that I'm on the spot, I'm not sure what I would call it. But I don't think it's corruption. Well, no, and I'll tell you why. I think the feds genuinely believe.
No. It's fine. How would corruption?
No, V. Hang on. I want to hear the answer.
V. Shut up. I wouldn't say that all the time, V, but quite a lot of the time.
I want to hear the answer.
So I genuinely think that the people who were working for the federal government who asked Twitter, hey, can you take down the Hunter Biden laptop story? Mm-hmm. I think they genuinely thought it was a Russian op.
No, they didn't.
I don't think they did at all, no. I don't think they did at all. I think that is quite the assumption there, Dev. But even if they did, they were grossly incompetent. They had every reason to think it wasn't. They knew the story of how the laptop was submitted. The laptop contained visual evidence of these crimes, as well as documentary evidence of these crimes. That was their source. There was no other source for the information. It was just that source. So if they were aware of what was on it, then they were aware that it was not a Russian op. It was blatantly a lie, Dev. Blatantly. Or a case of colossal incompetence that's completely inexcusable. So unless I like that V is going for the throat, but he needs to learn to just give Dev enough rope to hang up. In this case, for sure, yeah. The idea of like just piling on an opponent when they can't respond, it doesn't create a satisfying victory. And there's plenty of victory to be had here. If Dev wanted to add something to Sargon's point that was an important like addition to it, that would make sense. But he's kind of changing topics. So I don't want to go too hard on him, obviously, but he does have that sort of energy sometimes.
And they're like, we got some bullshit.
Wasn't she the one who did?
What do you base on this?
Like, no, Jen Psaki. Jen Psaki.
They genuinely thought this. Like.
No, V. Hang on a second.
The thing is, right.
Dev is like appealing to some nebulous unknown person, but it was going to be Jen Psaki, right? So you think Jen Psaki genuinely believed that these Twitter accounts?
I think someone genuinely believed that the Hunter Biden laptop story was actually not a true story. It was a Russian psyop, and they said you got to take this shit down because we saw what happened.
Jen Psaki who made the requests, wasn't it?
Maybe okay.
Or her office.
Then fine.
It's her office, right? So again, you appeal to a hypothetical or an abstract when we can name the individuals.
Okay, you can name them, but nonetheless, it was
not a great point, Sargon. It wouldn't really matter who it was. The better point is what I made, that it's literally impossible to know what the information was whilst not understanding that it clearly is genuine.
It's a genuine, true belief that was... No, it was a genuine false belief. They believed it, but they were wrong.
Why do you assume this?
But even
Yeah, that is a good question, though, from V. Why do you assume that? Of all the things that you could assume, when you know how corrupt our opponents are, why would you give them the assumption that they believed it genuinely? Everything that we've seen from them in all these years indicates, no, this is exactly the kind of basic, bland, plain and boring lie that they would tell, which mostly just their own people believe, which is completely counter to the facts. And frankly, as I've been saying, you couldn't be aware of what the information is without being aware that it's not a Russian op. Jack, so am I. I'm streaming right now. Now, granted, I can pause the video, but I'm still responding live in real time with as little time as Sargon has to do so. I'm not saying his points were bad, just that last one was kind of meaningless. That last one was kind of like a memory check. Do you remember which part of the government did? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. Like, it would matter if we go into greater depth, if we keep talking about this. But the point doesn't need to be made. You can defeat this with the basics, as I've given. But you want a centrist TM. I guess I could explain that, though. I do view politics as being generally on a spectrum, which is not the Overton window, but is something fairly universal. Because I think the different ways of doing politics can ultimately be, politics and lots of other things too, can ultimately be placed on a pretty universal, objective, close to objective spectrum of things, where, for example, you'll have hot and cold, you'll have fast and slow, these very basic concepts which fall on roughly the same places on the spectrum. They can sort of, the poles can sometimes swap depending on the context, but you've got a spectrum that is pretty consistent across all things. And there is a point at which it's basically the most extreme that you could imagine. Now, you could theoretically go further, but you don't need to. It's kind of diminishing returns at a certain point. So in terms of extremity, there's no limit, but there is sort of a slowing point where it's essentially a limit. And you can find that in both directions. And so finding both of those limiting points and then picking not necessarily the middle, that's the next part, but saying that both of those sides of the dichotomy of any political issue are inherently valid and may be necessary at some point. And beyond that, it's a matter of attenuating where you fall on that spectrum according to what is needed. Now, what I'm describing here is probably what a lot of people do to assess their position on politics, but I'm specifying it. And that, I would say, is my philosophical centrism. It's the perception, generally, that both sides are valid and you need to adjust the pressure. You need to adjust where you go with the pressure of the day. Regardless the Overton window, you use the truth to determine where the balance is. Rather than the sides. You ignore what the sides are, like you ignore trying to make a mathematical balance of the sides or some sort of autistic, meaning sparse balance of the sides. And you instead recognize that they're inherently valid and that both can be a solution to the excess of the other. And then you attenuate by truth. A little bit different than what Dev does. Someone says, remember how Dev said that Westerners aren't the same as Romanians and aren't capable of that kind of corruption in government? He's wrong.
Where there's a government, there is corruption, no matter where you go.
Pretty much exclusively, yeah. Well, we've covered this as far as I'm going to. That's the end of the video, chat. But yeah, Dev still being as usual, and drunk on government is one way of putting it, that this guy says. I don't know why, I mean, I do know why, but it is beyond reason that Dev should be so trusting of government. The evidence of his very eyes for the last 10 years at least should have put him well beyond the reaches of that kind of stupidity and naivety.
I was going to say, I never really know what to say when Dev's brought up because, again, I don't watch his content. I really don't know much about him. I just know what everyone else says. And, like, everything I've seen of him has been super cringe.
Yeah.
So just, like, it's kind of, I just hate hearing his
Fair enough.
name now.
Yeah, he's someone that a lot of us trusted or were close to. So it does matter. And he's still a major player on our side. So I feel it's my responsibility to criticize him, and I also enjoy doing so. It allows me to use some of the skills I've learned on someone who should have learned them.
Well, yeah, no, because as well, I've heard a lot of like how he's acted behind the scenes, specifically from people that have been around him. But his content and everything like that, I've never watched any Dev content ever.